In this video, we're going to be talking about Formzy's live Boolean tools. This started out as a simple cube, and then just by doing some simple sculpting moves using the various tools that we're going to be talking about today, we created this abstract piece of sculpture. And that's really how I like to think of the live sculpting tools. It really is like you're playing with some clay. So let's get into it. We're going to start off with just a simple cube in this exercise, and it doesn't really matter how you get there. You could use the cube tool as a primitive, or you could draw it using the rectangle tool as a simple extrusion. Like I said, it doesn't really matter how you get there. We're just going to use this basic form as our starting point. And many of the tools that we're talking about today live in the Reshape palette. And you can see a few across the top here that we're going to really be talking about in this fundamentals video. The Reshape tool, offset outline, and offset segment. And we're going to revisit some other tools from previous tool palettes as we move forward. First, we're going to start off with the Reshape tool, and looking at the tool options here, you'll notice that there's a few options that we'll want to keep our eye on. We can choose to have our reshape perpendicular to the reference plane, perpendicular to the surface that we choose. We can choose to keep edges or not, and then we can have a set height or a dynamic height, and of course there's a little pull down menu with some shortcuts to some commonly used distances. Once you hover over your object with the Reshape tool selected, so this is using the post pick method, right? We don't have any geometry selected ahead of time. We're just simply invoking the command. When we hover over various faces on our solid object here, they highlight in red as the outline, and then we click on that, and it allows us to reshape that, again, perpendicular to the surface, as is the selection in the tool options palette. Now, the power of this really is live sculpting, and let me show you what we mean by that. So we're going to now combine this with a couple other tools. So the offset segment tool is exactly as it implies, and there are a few options that we'll want to take a look at up here in the tool options for that tool. Extend to boundary and insert are typically on by default, and then dynamic, which allows us to click on any segment and then start dragging it along a face, and we get a duplicate of that segment anywhere we want. And if we wanted to type in a number at this point, we can. Of course, we could choose a distance as well if we just wanted to set that ahead of time. Now you'll notice this segment over here has been split into two, and I can click and offset that segment dynamically as well. So every time you pull a new offset down along another edge, it splits it into multiple edges, which can then further be offset if you'd like. Now, if we go back to the Reshape tool, we can now see that these faces are indeed split. And the reason that happened was because when we were on the offset segment tool, the insert tool box was checked. So it's inserting that segment into the face. It's not going to be a separate object. So that's what happens if you uncheck that box and we offset a segment and pull it down. And you'll notice when I deselect here that that object is a silhouette edge. It's actually a thick edge, and that visually helps us separate what is an inserted edge versus a non-inserted edge. Of course, that depends on your graphic display settings. If you have silhouette edges turned off, you won't see that differentiation. So just to show you what I'm talking about, if I right-click on my shaded work mode and go into my shaded work options, there is a separate checkbox for silhouette edges, and when I turn that off, now all the edges look the same. So it's a little harder to differentiate which ones are part of an object and which ones are separate. So you may want to make sure that you have an understanding of what that checkbox is actually doing. Again, we're in shaded work mode right now. And so you can choose to insert those edges or not. Sometimes you want to just duplicate an edge and not have it be welded into the object that you're duplicating it from. And so that's what that insert checkbox is all about right there. So now going back to the Reshape tool, we can begin now to push and pull. And this is the live Boolean aspect of the Reshape tool. So you can see that if I pull it out, it is indeed stretching that face of that object out. And if I decide to push it in, it is carving away. I don't have to build a whole separate object and then go through my Boolean difference tools like I showed in a different video. And you'll notice that this other edge is still just sitting out here, again, because it wasn't part of that original object. So you can see how you can begin to quickly start to sculpt an object into an abstract shape in this case, but this is really a great way to start to carve away or add to existing objects. Now let's talk about the offset outline tool. Clicking on that tool, again, we have an insert checkbox and dynamic and distance, and this one again does exactly like it says on the label. It creates an offset. And on a simple face like this one, it's very straightforward. It's offsetting an edge inward. Of course, you can go outward as well. If I go outward, I'm creating an entirely new object. But if I go inward, it does a very simple offset on all four sides of that object. Now, if I move to a face that is a different shape, something a little bit more complex, and I click on that, watch what happens when the offset gets beyond the point where the offset will work in this leg of the face. As I start to pull that in farther and farther, you see it automatically heals to create a shape that makes sense. So that's a great time-saving feature of not having to clean up weird edges in your geometry. It's going to take care of that automatically. Again, going back to the reshape tool, now if I start pushing and pulling this, you can see it leaves that face behind. I can push in or I can pull out. And it's a very quick way to start to sculpt your geometry. Now, one other option in the reshape tool here is to keep edges. And so watch what happens now when I reshape this entire face. It actually leaves the original boundary edges where they were. So I don't have to then offset those segments back into the object. I just have them automatically to work with, and I can start to push and pull. And again, you want to be very aware of whether keep edges is on or off, because the more you use the reshape tool, the possibility of leaving edges behind is very high. And the goal is always to have the cleanest geometry possible. And if you start to get into instances like this, where you have a bunch of coplanar faces that you don't want to see ultimately in the end, you don't want to delete those edges. You want to use a tool here found in the meshes palette, where we can then unmesh. This is the one that will get rid of all of the lines between coplanar faces and clean up your geometry. So just clicking on that object one time gets rid of all those coplanar faces, simplifies it back down. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn the keep edges option off, and we can see what happens here as I start to sculpt away at this object. One thing that I like to do in particular with these three tools is actually set keyboard shortcuts for them. Now, there's two ways to do that. You could go under the Edit menu into Keyboard Shortcuts. You can scroll through these tools and you can find them. But what I like to do is simply right-click on the tool itself and choose the Set Shortcut option. And you can see here that there isn't a key shortcut assigned to this already. And so for this one, I would choose something like the letter P for push-pull, because maybe I'm coming from SketchUp and I'm used to that tool shortcut, and now it's been assigned in Form Z. Let's go to the Offset Outline tool and set a shortcut to the letter O. And let's click OK, and let's go to Offset Segment, and let's set a shortcut to the letter I. So now all of these keys are next to each other, and I like to think of this as push-pull, outline, and then insert segment. That's how I think of it. Another thing you'll notice is when you hover over these with your tooltips turned on, the keyboard shortcut is now indicated in the tooltip. The reason I would go through and do something like that is because now it makes it very fast to model. So I can actually be spinning my model around. I can hit the O key for outline. I can hit the P key to push-pull a face. I can hit the I key to offset a segment. So I could offset a segment just down here and it makes total sense. It's going across. But watch what happens when I pull it down below that intercepting section of geometry. You can see it actually is extending it all the way across that piece. And if I come down even further, it's extending it through here. And again, using my keyboard shortcuts, I can just keep my fingers on these tools, reshape, push, pull, insert segment, insert outline, push, and I can very quickly start to cut away at this object in real time and just have some fun sculpting this object into whatever I want. I'm going to clean this up and get rid of my segment back here that I left behind at one point. Another thing that's happening while you're reshaping is you have your object snaps at play if you have your object snaps turned on. So remember, you can always turn those off completely and never have to worry about snapping to anything. But if you turn them on, I like to often have the end point snap turned on. So then when I pull a segment up and offset it, it can automatically align with other geometry. And again, now that that aligns with that, I can pull this out and I have coplanar faces. And if I need to unmesh, I can. Another way you can use object snaps are by snapping to the midpoint. So if I wanted to create kind of a stair stepping point down here, I might actually go down and turn on my interval snap. Let's go down here and right click on our snap options, choose that from the contextual menu. And I'm going to go ahead and set my interval to 3. It was already set to 3, which is great. And I'm going to zoom in. And now when I pull this snap up, you can see it will actually snap to this segment in thirds. My midpoint is also showing up, so maybe I want to turn my midpoint snap off just so that I don't accidentally choose my midpoint. So if I go ahead and select there, and now I want to turn my midpoint back on because I want to divide this segment in half to get equal thirds. You see now I have 3 equal faces. Going back to my push-pull tool. Now I'm going to pull this out and I'm going to set this to 2 feet by typing that number into my distance field at the top. And I'm going to pull this one out 1 foot. So 1 foot and enter. And now that is going to have an exact equal distance for these 2 first steps. So using all of these tools kind of in conjunction with numeric input and snapping gives you quite a few options for creating very precise geometry at the same time as using some very dynamic tools with the insert and offset and reshape tools. So everything on this object so far has been done rectilinearly. We have rectangle shape that we started with, and every time we do an offset, we're offsetting an outline that already exists. What if we wanted to use different types of shapes? This is where the shapes palette comes into play. So I'm going to open up my shapes palette, and of course we have our rectangle. We also now have 3-pointed rectangles, so we can do rotated rectangles. We have polygons, we have circles. And one of the tool options early on that we skipped over was the ability to add openings to our objects. So let's go ahead and just keep it on the default of insert through solid mass. And let's put a circular hole through this object. So now it becomes very important to have the dynamic reference plane in play. And you can see that it is updating visually and snapping to every face as I hover over it. And that is accomplished by having the reference plane lock button turned off. So alternatively, if I turn that on and I hover over these faces, we can see that the reference plane never shows up in any new or alternate location. It just stays locked to the XY plane. And of course, you can shift that and it's going to stay locked in whatever position you put it in because you've chosen to lock it with the reference plane lock button down here in this part of the tool palette. I'm going to go back to my XY plane and I'm going to hover over, again with the circle tool with the insert opening option chosen. Now I can click and drag and pull a circle out, and you can see again in a live Boolean style, it's just cutting a hole into this object and all the way through it because through solid mass has been chosen in the tool option. And this works with all of our other tools as well. So if we wanted to go ahead and put a 3-point rectangle down here, I can choose to insert this opening in an alternate degree from the original. And now the reshape tools come back into play, of course. If I hover over the kind of invisible face, if you will, of this hole, you'll notice that the outline of the hole itself becomes selected. Whereas if I hover over the face that is adjacent to that, it's outlining the segment that surrounds that face. So you can see if I pull that one off, I get that shape. If I hover over the circle, I get that shape. I'm going to choose this option and I'm going to go a little bit larger than I would think just to illustrate this. Insert was turned on. So now that circular segment has been inserted into this face. So if I then go back to my reshape tool and I pull on this face, you'll see again in a live Boolean style that is extruding. And you'll notice if I extrude it beyond this face, because I made that offset large, there's no continuation of that circle there because it was actually cut off, again, inserted only into the face that it was coplanar inside of. So you'll want to think about how you want these things to play out as you're doing this. And now if I reshape this, I could maybe push this back in and get a nice little notch there. So there's a lot of really interesting things that can happen. And what I like about it especially is that it's always creating very clean geometry. It's something that FormZ really excels at. So just like using the shapes tools to insert holes, we can also use the draw palette to insert segments that are not parallel or perpendicular to existing segments that live on these faces. So if we go back to the offset segment tool, I'm always choosing a known segment as a starting point, so I can only ever duplicate that segment off of an original one and therefore get a parallel segment to it. If I want to insert my own segment at some different angle, I could do that by using the line tool. So what I'm going to do is go to my 2D surface, and I'm going to now check the insert box up in here. And with this, I can now click on my endpoints that I want to split a face for. And visually, you can tell that it inserted that face in there to split this into two different faces because it is the thin line weight. So now if I go back to the Reshape tool and pull this out, you'll notice that it indeed did split that. And let's go ahead and push this one in so we can see how that's actually working. And it's a fantastic way to get off-angle segments inserted. So now let's do it with the vector line tool. So I'm going to start up here on this face, and let's do something that's kind of a zigzag shape. Double click to end that line. It then splits that face into two. Going to Reshape, now I can reshape that, and we'll notice that it was indeed inserted. That works for any of these draw tools. So if you wanted to insert an arc, for example, so I'm going to go ahead and insert an arc 4. I'm going to hit the E key to end it. Remember, in an earlier video, we talked about the E key to end and the C key to close. I don't want to close this arc up. I want to end it. So I'm going to tap the E key. You can see that it inserted that edge into this polygon, and it split that face into two different pieces. So going back to my Reshape tool now, I can click on this and I can pull this up and create another step in there, this time with a curving front edge. Now everything I've shown you so far with the Reshape tools work on a post-pick basis. So again, we choose the tool first, then we hover over the face that we want to modify, and we modify it. So that only allows us to choose one face at a time. Now, if we go ahead and choose the pre-pick method to reshape multiple faces at the same time, that also works. So what I'm going to do in my topological level here is I'm going to set it to the face option, and I'm going to pre-pick, let's say, this face and this face using the shift key, and maybe let's select the outer face of this C shape as well. So holding the shift key down to add that to my selection. Now if I choose the Reshape tool, I can move all of those at the same time. So again, I can push them into and live cut, or I can pull them outward and add to my object, and it's going to still work in the same way. It's just applying it to all at the same time. So that's going to work pretty nicely when you don't want to remember how much you moved them. Let's say you're doing the dynamic method and not really noting how far you're moving faces, but you want them to move the same amount. You'll want to use the pre-pick method. So one last thing about these tools being reference plane based. Remember, we're always going to be using the reference plane as the orientation of the opening that we're going to be inputting into the objects. And you do need to start on the object that you want to place the opening into. So if I've locked my reference plane down to the base of the object, and I try to click up here, I get this symbol on my cursor that says you can't do that. Now, if I go underneath my object and I start to draw that opening, you can see that I can click and actually start to draw that just fine. Now, you'll also notice that it is not placing an opening into this object. And that is because being reference plane based, it is going a certain direction. And right now, it is trying to push that down away from my object rather than go through it. So it's something to be aware of. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go up and choose a different location for a reference plane. Using this tool here, I can now define a new reference plane. I'm going to click on this polygon on my object. And to illustrate this, I'm going to again choose the circle with insert hole. And I'm going to just start by carving a circle into my object. And you can see that it pushes it away from that reference plane and it's not going the opposite direction. So something to be aware of as you're doing your carving. If you want to carve a certain direction through your object, you'll see that it didn't stop. It went all the way through that object, but it also only went from that reference plane outward. So something to be aware of as you're doing some live sculpting on your objects. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to get notified when new videos are released on this channel, click the subscribe button below and click the notification bell icon to get a notification when new videos are released. See you in the next one.